What is up, everyone? As you can see from the title, this video is going to be about what it's like being a paramedic. So for those who don't know, I've been doing paramedicine for around 4 years. I've been doing it since pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, so I have the perspective from before and after. And I thought I'd make this video because not a lot of people, especially just the general public, they don't know what it's like to be a paramedic or a first responder in general, how you respond to 911 calls, what the job's like, how you become a paramedic. So in today's video, I asked a few family and friends which questions they would like to be answered, what are their burning questions, and I would do my best to answer them. I mean, when you first think of being a paramedic or EMT in America, you're gonna think fast-packed adrenaline, you're gonna think high stress all the time, the job's just go, go, go. Is that really the case of how the movie depicts it? Well, I would say yes and no. The job definitely encompasses that, but it's definitely not every day. You definitely have to be prepared for life-threatening situations, critical situations, but it's not like every day you're dealing with that. I feel like entertainment and movies in general kind of sensationalize a lot of the trauma just for entertainment value. If you're under the impression that every day is like that, no, that's not the case. And I think that's for the betterment of every first responder, because dealing with that constant stress is not good for anyone. As much as they prepare you for school or you have the personality for it, you really can't see traumatic events every day like that, or it would just, you just have to be really resilient to overcome that. So I just want to get that out of the way right away, because I know that's the first thing that people come into their mind when they think of being a first responder or paramedic. I guess that's a good segue to the first question here, which is, what does a typical day look like for a paramedic? So just a bit of context, I've been a paramedic in 2 different services, and I've done a ride out or training experience in one other big service. So I can give you my opinion based off, a big populous service. So every day it's gonna be a 12-hour shift. There's no deviation from that unless you have a specialized shift like a transfer shift or all-day station or whatnot. But typically when you first sign on as a paramedic, it will be a 12-hour shift, and it alternates between days and nights. So the typical day starts, let's say you start 6 a.m. shift, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. The common courtesy in all the agencies and services I've worked in is to come 30 minutes beforehand to provide relief. Instead of 6 a.m. you come 5:30, and then the 6 p.m. guys, the night shift guys, could go home at 5:30. And that's just kind of how it's always been the culture since I've joined, and it's been like that from what I can understand for many years now, and hard to escape that. So when you have a shift that says 6, it's actually 5:30. Well, when you first start off, you're gonna have to see where you're located, and this is a big thing that I find a lot of my friends and family have misconceptions about. They think that we're just based out of a hospital. We just stay at the hospital if we have no calls, but that's not the case at all. There are several paramedic stations scattered across the neighborhoods, as you would expect, to cover the wide range of populace that we have to care for, right? So when you first start off, you won't have a secured base or a permanent station, so you would have to call in for the dispatcher maybe an hour or 2 hours before your shift, depending on how far it is, to get the location of your base. If you're in a big city or a big geological area mass, it could cover a wide area. You could be covering 70 to 100 kilometer difference between stations, so that's something you have to keep in mind. So anyways, the first thing you do, you start day shift, you wake up, you call the dispatcher or supervisor, you get notified your station. Once you get notified your station, you head there. Like I said, if it's a 6 a.m. shift, you go there 5:30, and you relieve your colleagues who just did the night shift. So you do a truck check, which usually involves the equipment as well as a vehicle check. The most important part, I think, would be the equipment check. So you have to make sure you have all the medical equipment stocked, and usually the crew before you will let you know, but sometimes they'll miss something. So the onus is really up to you, because you don't want to be in a critical call and are missing a vital piece of equipment. So you do a bag check, which we have airway bag, circulation bag, trauma bag, pediatric bag. You want to do a defib check. So every paramedic truck comes with a defibrillator. If you don't know what they are, they look like this. This is the public defib, but in services we have our dedicated, more, I guess, advanced defibs, and you have to check that the voltage actually fires. So every shift you do a shock test to make sure it's actually firing and not malfunctioning. You do a diagnostic on the machine to make sure everything is running smooth, and then that's good for the defib. And then, like I said, you do a equipment check, make sure you have everything. You want to do a vehicle check too, because you are held liable for any damage to the vehicle. So you want to make sure there's no damage beforehand, so it doesn't get pinned on you. You want to make sure it passes the general inspection, safe safety inspections. And once that's all done, you go to base. You're pretty much on standby at base until a 911 call comes in. And generally, you're not on standby for too long, especially in busy centers. You actually get a call right away as soon as you walk in, at least based on my experience in these big mega city services. So you're hardly at base at all. It depends on how many crews are at your station. So, well, let me just backtrack a bit. So how it works is you have 2 people on one truck, okay? So that's normally a paramedic shift. You have your partner and yourself, and that's it. And then you may have additional crews at your base depending on how large the base is. If it's just you and your partner, of course, when the call comes in on the announcer, so they announce severity of the call and short details. For example, it'll say code 4, breathing problem. So you'll know that the problem is breathing. And then once you get to your truck, the dispatcher will usually push a message or notification on a device. And this will be different based off the service you are, which device they push it to, but they will push the details that they got during the 911 call. So then once you read the details, you log on, you acknowledge you got the call, and then you acknowledge you're on the way. And there's several codes we use to communicate with the dispatchers through the radio, and then you'll be on your way to the call. I guess before the call starts, if there's multiple crews at the base, it's known as who's up first. So pretty much, obviously we just signed in, so we'll be up first because the night crew was there all night. And then if we finish that call and come back, and then another crew comes back after us, we'll be up first again. But if we come back and there's a second or third crew, then we'll be second up or third up respectively, unless they call specifically for an advanced unit or specialty unit. That's typically how the workflow works. And this job is very dynamic where you don't know what's coming in until you hear that announced buzzer. It's kind of on an on-ear basis of what's going on. And then every day is different too. Like I said before, you only have 2 people on your truck. You take turns between driving the ambulance and attending. Generally, attending is the person leading the call. So I don't know if anyone's called 911 before or called paramedics, but generally there's 2 people walking in, and one of them will lead the call, gathering incident history, diagnosis, transport decision, and methods and treatments. And the other partner generally does the vitals and gives your opinion based off what you're communicating with your partner. And then they drive, and then you're at the back attending if they need more medicine, if they need an IV push, if they need you to breathe for them. That's all the attending person responsibility. And the responsibility of the driver is to get there safely, whether it's lights and sirens or a non-emergency run. They also have to patch to the hospital, telling them what it is if it is a high acuity call. There's certain hospital facilities that specialize in strokes, trauma, heart attacks. So you have to really make your transport decision known and give the hospital heads up so they can prepare their specialty team, because we're coming in right away and treatment is expected to be done right away. So that's generally the flow of a day, a typical day. And then you repeat that like constantly until your shift is done. So you do that for 12 hours. Let's say you finish that call and it was a breathing problem, right? Maybe like an asthma attack, and you were able to transport and stabilize. Afterwards, you do paperwork. So paperwork is very important in this profession because that's what they hold to court when anything happens. So you have to make sure your paperwork is done within legal requirements. So you usually have an hour after transporting to the hospital to do the paperwork to make sure everything is done. And then after that, you switch. So if you were attending, you'll be the driver now, and then your driver will be attending. And after you switch, you clear the hospital, and the dispatcher will let you know if you can return to base, or if you need coverage to another base, or if you get a call right away. Let's say you just clear and there's a call in your area, you can go to that. So really, it's up to the discretion of the dispatcher, operational demand, what's needed, what coverage is needed. So let's say you cover one sub-district and they want you to go 30 minutes drive to the other district to cover. That's what you have to do, and you'll be in that area until a call comes in. And then you could go jump from that to a different hospital and then keep doing that, so on and so forth, until your shift ends. And that's typically the day. And then hopefully you get back in base in time, because I say hopefully because just with the nature of this job, if a 911 call comes in 1 minute before your shift ends, I mean, you can't say no, right? So that'll definitely push you to a 14-hour shift, 15-hour shift. Yeah, it's pretty tiring, but that's just the nature of the job, and there's no way around that. That's a long answer, but that's a typical day as a paramedic. It's really dynamic. I wish I could give you examples, but really every day is different. And the main thing that it stays consistent is really the diagnosis first look right away. And what I mean by that is you enter the house or the park or the school or whatever the scenario is, and you can immediately tell, is this a sick or not sick? Is this a load and go, or can we take our time here? And prioritizing that right away is very important. There's almost something in paramedicine called diesel therapy, where you want to get them as quick as possible without wasting any time, because that precious amount of time can can be life-threatening. So we want to make that decision really quick and snappy. Okay, so that's what a typical day of a paramedic looks like. Okay, so second question that I got from someone here is, how do you get into becoming a paramedic? To become a paramedic, you definitely need to go to some sort of paramedic school, a college diploma or a private school that can teach you the medical knowledge necessary to perform the job. Usually accredited schools will be a 2-year program where they really drill into you theories of anatomy, biology, pharmacology. There's one called therapeutic communication, because this job is a lot of talking to patients in the proper manner. ECGs too, because you do a lot of cardiograms. That's the core curriculum. And like I said, 2 years at a standard college. In that schooling, there's something called OSCEs, which is a scenario testing, which you simulate 911 scenarios. And that's a very important portion of paramedic schooling, because you need to pass that with at least a 60% every semester, or you just fail your course. So even if you get 90% to 100% in anatomy, chemistry, all those courses, if you fail your scenarios, you just fail the year. And that makes sense because this job is very hands-on and practical. So you really need to perform in that scenario and not make any bad decisions or judgment calls. And also in school, there's something called rideouts. And rideouts is very important. I can almost compare it to a internship. It is a 6-month trial period where you tag along with another crew, a full-time paramedic crew as a student. So you'll be the third man. And the whole purpose of this is to get practical experience of what the job's going to be like. And for most students, this is where you really see what it's like to be a paramedic, because it's 6 months shadowing a full-time schedule. You'll have your hands dirty. Any call that comes in that they would do, you would do. You will learn directly from them. You will know how the schedule is like with a 12-hour day and night alternating. You'll know what you signed yourself up for, what calls, if you can handle it or not. And I want to stress this part a lot, because a lot of people will ask me, oh, how do you know if you can do paramedicine? How do you know if you can handle all the stuff you can see? Well, this is really where you will find out, because this is where you actually get to see what it's like. You could theorize all you want. Like I said in the beginning of the video, you may think the job is like this based off what entertainment depicts it. But once you actually start doing the job, that's when you'll be like, can I do this or can I not? And I know a lot of classmates of mine who decided to drop out of the program after doing a stint of rideouts because they realized they couldn't do it. It wasn't for them. So if you're ever thinking about if you can become or are willing to be a paramedic, this rideout is the main determinant, in my opinion, for that. And of course, you'll know what the job is. This job is not really a convoluted one like other job titles. A paramedic is a paramedic, 911 first response in medical expertise. But you may have the expectation that you check all these boxes, but you won't actually know until actually doing it. I guess personally for me, this is another question that someone asked me. How did I know I can do it? I didn't until rideouts. After I did it, I was like, okay, so this is how the job is, and am I okay with it? And yeah, at the time I was okay with it. I thought, yeah, this is okay. I've seen a lot. I could deal with the schedule and I'll sign up for it. You realize that paramedic school or the career in general, it really snowballs. So once you finish school, it really escalates to the job, and then you're working, and then it's a cycle like that. And then you generally get used to it. But even if you do the job for 15 years, there are some calls you'll never see. It just really depends on your luck and where you are at the time. So just keep that in mind if you are pursuing this profession. But after schooling and rideouts, then you have to do the AMCA. So the AMCA stands for Advanced Emergency Medical Certificate, and it's a license that you have to get in order to become a paramedic. So you have to sign up to do an exam, and the exam I think is around 3 to 5 hours with a 1 hour or 2 hour break in between. And it's essentially a medical knowledge exam with some scenario questions in there, and you have to score, I think it's at least 80% to get accredited. So after you graduate, that's what you have to do. You have to sign up for a session, and then you have to pass that exam to get accredited to be eligible to be a paramedic. That's just the knowledge aspect of the way. There is also a lift test you have to do. So because this job involves, of course, lifting a lot of patients, you may have apartments that don't have elevators. You may have to lift them down the stairs. They may be dead weight. So there's a lift requirement that you have to do. When I was doing school, it was around 210 pounds that you have to lift. The lifting requirements involves, of course, the stretcher, manually lifting the stretcher with the patient on it. But it also involves something we call stair chair. So we have various extrication tools that we can use to get a patient out of a scene if egress and ingress are not ideal. And a stair chair is essentially as it sounds. It's a chair where you put them on and strap them in so you could carry them down the stairs, because of course a stretcher you can't do that because of the bulkiness and the heaviness of the stretcher. So that's another lift test where you put a 2 10-pound dummy and you have to lift it with a partner down a flight of stairs, back and up 2 times, I believe. So that's another test. And then there's a fore and aft, which is a lift with just you and your partner where you carry them. And I'll show you like a video of fore and aft, but essentially one person's grabbing them underneath the armpits and one is below the legs, and you lift them up. And that's generally the safest way to lift a patient with no devices. So those are the main extrication lift tests. Every service needs that before you even apply. So there's certain programs that test all these skills that I mentioned, and they're good for 6 months once you do it, and you get that 6 months. And then once you get that, you can start applying to all the services you want to apply to. So once you get your AMCA and your lift tests out of the way, you pass the physical requirements, you pass the medical knowledge requirement, it's actually the hiring process now, right? So this is going to be very different from typical jobs, because people think that, oh, you just submit your resume and they just hire you and see you around and that's it. No, there's a lot more steps it takes to actually get hired at a service. At least where I apply, they only hire once a year. So you have to send your application that time around. If you miss it, then you have to wait a whole year. And it's every service you want to apply to, which is big geographical regions, right? And then the first step always is a exam. So it's a medical exam and everything is scored. So usually there's 1,000 to 2,000 applicants every service. It's usually a 5-step process. First one being the exam, and you have to score, the top percentile to move on. Each of these categories, you have to score the top percentile to move on. First step is an exam, which is medical knowledge. So you have to score, the top, let's say 10% percentile or along that way. And then you move on to the next step. If you fail step 1, then sorry, you have to brush up on your studies and you have to repeat and wait a year. So after you pass the medical test, which is usually, I would say 2 to 3 hours, and it's different depending on each service. They're all catered differently, the questions, but of course based off medical knowledge of what you're going to do as a paramedic. Second step is MMIs. So MMIs is multi-mini interviews. So instead of one long interview, like a 1 hour long interview, it'll be broken down to many different interviews. And these interviews will be generally 10 to 15 minutes long, and they're very different from a classic interview. They're not going to ask you questions like, why do you want this job? What are your greatest strengths and weaknesses? No, for this hiring process, they don't do that. They do ask you very specific critical thinking questions. So one question I can tell you in my hiring process was, oh, what do you think about euthanasia? And do you think it should be legalized in your country? And you have 10 minutes to argue your point, and that's one of the 5 MMIs on the same day. So then after you clear that one, it's kind of like a bell robin. They'll sound a horn, so they time limit you 6 to 8 minutes per question. So that was one question I give, for example. You have 6 minutes to answer to the best of your ability. You give your answer, you explain it, you hear a horn, and then you move to the next room. And usually it's supervisors that are interviewing you, so 5 different supervisors for the service you are picking. And then next question, and then you get 6 minutes, next question. And then after that, that's step 2. And then I guess the supervisors will deliberate and average out your score between the 5 MMI interviews. And then you move on to step 3. And step 3 is the scenarios. So like I mentioned, School of Paramedicine is heavily determined by scenarios. So this scenario process will be, again, another round robin. It may be 3, it may be 5, but it's going to be exact same format, usually 15 to 20 minutes this time, where they simulate a 911 scenario. And then you have to do the scenario. And then how they simulate it, because talk about scenarios, but I didn't really get too deep, but they'll provide all the environment, they'll provide a room, they'll provide you with a partner, which is usually already a paramedic in the service, and they'll provide you all the equipment that the service use, except they'll simulate the scenario with fake blood, fake dummy, and all that. I'll just give you an example. Let's say one of the scenarios, you apply to the service, they have 5 scenarios, and you're going to be assigned a random scenario. It's going to be like a round robin with 5 other people, right? So first scenario is a MCI, multi-casual incident on the freeway with 4 cars and 2 patients. That'll be a scenario, and they say go, you have 15 minutes, and then you have to go through the proper steps, proper procedures and treatment plan, communication. Sometimes there's yelling bystanders, sometimes there's just stuff going on that they add to the scenario to mimic a real life, and then you handle that, and then you do everything you think you need to do for the scenario, and then the buzzer will horn. Okay, next scenario is a heart attack. You walk in, it's a heart attack, and then you go through the steps and so on and so forth until you do the 3 to 5 scenarios. And then there's an objective scoring criteria they score you on between 1 to 7 in 5 dimensions. Again, like I said before, it's a top percentile score. So you pass the interviews, you pass the written exam, and now you have to get top percentile in scenarios, and then it pushes you into the next round. So once you're done all skis, the next round, it will push you to driving tests, right? So because paramedic, you drive an ambulance, that's a big portion of the job. Yeah, and this may be a shock to you guys, but paramedic school does not teach you driving at all. In the province that I work for, you need an F license, which is a small bus to an ambulance. That's what F license is for. And you have to self-teach yourself that because the school doesn't teach you that. So how I did it is I just rented a vehicle that size, and then I made a mini obstacle course with a few buddies of mine and classmates, and we kind of tried to simulate what we thought the drive test would be. And generally the drive test is going to be actually an obstacle course. That's how it was for the services I applied to, which they have pylons, and there's a few things you have to do. You have to snake the ambulance like an S like this. You have to reverse snake. You have to parallel park. You definitely have to reverse park. There's a speed test too. One of my services, so you go straight and then they'll put a dummy up all of a sudden, and you have to swerve left or right to avoid it, and you have to test your ABS brake to swerve that. So that's something you have to do. Besides the obstacle course, you have to drive the ambulance around the big city. It's usually around 15 to 20 minutes around major roads, just to make sure you could actually drive it day to day, right? So that's the drive test. So generally the drive test is more straightforward. If you could drive the ambulance, you can drive it. That's just what they're testing and expecting, and it's really just a glance that you can drive the ambulance. And this is a really big thing to prospective paramedic students. Please get your F license before your final year of paramedic school, because I knew like a handful of people who didn't even have their G and they didn't do their F, so they went through all this training just to not have their license to even apply for the job. So please make sure you have the requirements for physical, AMCA, and your license, please, before you even start to think about this profession. Okay, so after the driving, which is step 4, you reach the final step, general manager or the equivalent, we call them the chief or vice chief of the service, as well as an HR person, to do a final interview. And this is really for formality, for a people check to see if you will fit in with the service. If you make it to this point, you pretty much got the job, unless there's something glaringly bad in that interview. But that's pretty much a final check where you could talk to leadership, ask questions that were lingering on your mind beforehand, and then after you're done that whole process, they will evaluate everyone and then send the offers. And you have to repeat this for every service you want. Okay, so that was a long answer of the question of how you become a paramedic. Okay, and since the last couple of steps were driving, let's talk about driving. So I think there's a common misconception with driving, especially as a 911 first response. Many people think that we can just cut red lights, go as fast as we can, as long as it's for emergency's sake, but that's completely not the case. We have to follow regulations in the Highway Traffic Act. So yes, we can cut red lights, but we do have to stop at every red light. And that makes sense, right? Because we want to make sure our entrance and route is safe before going. You don't know how many accidents I've seen because civilians don't hear or see the sirens or emergency vehicle, and they just run past, and then there's a collision that could have been avoided. So that's one thing that we do have to consider and stop for. Another thing is for the speed limit. Yes, we can go over the speed limit, but usually it's around 20 to 30 kilometers above the speed limit. Again, it's highlighted in the Highway Traffic Act. Although we can go a bit faster, it's not like we're going significantly faster to get to the emergency. There are some legal implications and laws that we must hold to. So that's something that I want to address and bring to the attention. And finally, for driving, there is one case where we cannot go past or bypass the normal legal system, and that would be school buses. So school buses have the double stop sign with their lights on, which indicates that they're loading or offloading children. We must stop in all cases, even in emergency, and that's because kids don't have the capacity to know what's going on, even in the emergency sense. So we don't want a kid to stray on the road, and then because we're going lights and sirens, leading to emergency, we don't want any unfortunate incidents happening. So the law requires us to always yield to school buses in that case. Okay, so those are some key takeaways from driving, at least in the legal aspect. But again, yeah, we can go over the speed limit and we can cross red lights with certain caveats. Okay, so another question I have is, what is the range of severity of patients that you deal with? Okay, very good question. And to answer that question, the range is very, very wide. Okay, I guess I'll just classify the severity for you based off what we classify as paramedic. So it goes from CTAS 5 to CTAS 1. CTAS 5 being the least severe, like a stubbed toe, and CTAS 1 being they're essentially dead and we have to do CPR on them. So that's the range. So I've got calls where they got a bloody nose. A 19-year-old got a bloody nose and they called 911. I'm not joking. That's a call, guys. And I've also got a call where, I mean, not to go into details, but I've got some pretty serious calls. So it goes to the least severity to the utmost highest severity. That's really the range. And like you said, you cannot really predict what you're getting, because even going to that bloody nose scenario, right? It may be a bloody nose, but the call details may come in as severe bleed based off what they're telling the dispatcher. So just because the call details say something doesn't doesn't mean that's actually true until you get there. And it goes the other way around. It could be what we call VSA, vital signs absent, which means dead, but it may just be a homeless guy sleeping there and someone was just walking by and called us. So that's something I want to say as well, that you really need to be cognizant of what call details come in and don't take it at face value until you get there. Not to say you shouldn't call resources. For example, that homeless situation, you probably do need to call another crew, fire, and police, just because if it is a VSA. But again, just take it with a grain of salt, the details you get. Okay, another question that's been asked is, what are some challenges you find with this job? I mean, there's a lot of challenges, right? Because everything's dynamic, everything's learning. There are challenges with extricating the patient, lifting them out. There are challenges with diagnosing the patient. Like I said, sometimes you get on scene and you don't know what's going on. So how do you treat this guy who's just unconscious? Like, why is he unconscious? There are like 100 different reasons why they're unconscious. So getting a differential diagnosis is fairly challenging. Transportation decisions are fairly challenging too, because every hospital specializes in something different and you don't want to overload one hospital with the other. And also a big challenge that I didn't think would be as challenging to me is actually the schedule. The 12 hours on minimum, the average being 13, 14, can really wear on you. That's essentially 70 hours, 60 to 70 hours in 1 week with really no break in between. And that can be tiring on your body. Luckily, I was young when I started this profession, so it wasn't too bad, but I could definitely see it wearing on me as the years went on. That's something that you do want to keep in mind if you're looking at this as a profession. It is pretty tiring, and I believe that is inherent to healthcare with a 12-hour shift cycling between day and night. Your body definitely needs to adjust to that, especially if you're just used to the standard 9 to 5, which most schools and work operate on. That's definitely a big adjustment. Okay, and then going to the opposite spectrum, what do I love the most about this job? Well, what I love the most about this job is actually helping people. When I see the gratitude and the change and difference we make to someone, there's really no better feeling than that. Seeing someone at their worst moment, because essentially no one calls 911 on their best moments, it's usually their worst, and then seeing how you could directly impact them is a big joy to me. Fortunately, we usually see them at their worst moment and then we don't see the outcome because we stabilize and transport to the hospital. But there are some rare situations where you could really see the gratitude of some of our patients, and also you could see the outcome. Maybe you come back to the hospital a few hours later and you check up on them, and to see that you essentially saved their lives in some cases, it really makes you take pride in this job. It makes you feel like you are doing a service, which you really are. This job is very tough, but this is why you do it, right? To save people's lives, to make a difference in the community, and to help people out. And that's what I love about the job the most. They could show that genuine gratitude. You see positive outcome. It's great. Okay, now I want to just talk about some miscellaneous paramedic stuff that I think would benefit the public. First thing is public defibrillators. So you see these everywhere in libraries, in schools, in recreational centers, and these are very important if someone's having a heart attack, guys. So if you see someone clutching their chest or even just pass out, definitely grab that. They're usually open to the public. They are very step-by-step proof, so you don't have to have any knowledge towards these machines. You turn it on and it'll say, step 1, get the pads, and it'll show the diagram where to put the pads, and then it'll tell you shock or no shock. Why I'm stressing this a lot is if someone's having a heart attack, that shock, getting that in as quick as possible can really save their lives. So if you see a family member, friend, or even a stranger that you think is having a heart attack and you're in a facility that has this, just run and get it right away and follow the instructions, because that could save their lives. So that's a public announcement I want to make, number 1. Another thing I want to note, if you do have any paramedic friends or colleagues or you see them around, never ask, oh, what's the craziest thing you've seen, or what's the worst call you've done? Like, why would you ask that, right? I feel like a lot of people don't think about the outcome when you ask that. So let's say I'm at a dinner and someone asks me, oh, what's the craziest thing you've done? Let's say I tell them a story and then it's like a crazy story where they're not used to the details, the visceral nature of it. They'll get pretty shocked, pretty sad generally, and then the whole mood is just soured, and then I get reminded of that horrible call. So what was the point of that besides mild curiosity? So never ask that to a paramedic or a 911 responder. That's just in bad taste. Okay, another thing I want to say for prospective paramedics or even paramedics in general, definitely practice your lifting techniques, because a lot of the job is lifting, because you have to get them to the hospital bed. So sheet transfer is very important. The lifts that I mentioned before, fore and aft, stair chair, even the stretcher at some points, you do not want to do improper form and really cause a bodily injury, because I've seen a lot of medics go through that, and it's a long recovery process. So definitely always be careful. Always use assistive tools if you can, like a slider board. Never take the quick way out because it will be causing you harm in the long run. And then another thing I want to talk about is seniority in paramedicine. So because this is a government job, seniority has a big role in the job. So what I talked about before, on a typical day where you first sign in and you have to see where your base is, I'm talking about someone who just started the job, so you'll be pretty low on the seniority list. But once you get higher seniority, you can bid for schedules and stations. That takes a lot of seniority, guys. Like for a decent station, it would take 10 to 15 years of working to get that permanent spot. Otherwise, it would be temporary spots if someone goes on mat leave or a supervisor position or whatnot. But other than that, yes, you do have to put the years in to get a dedicated spot or a schedule. Unfortunately, that if you're new, that's just something you have to deal with because it is a union job and seniority is a big factor in that. And again, seniority trickles down to almost everything in paramedicine. So you come with your partner. Usually, the person with the higher seniority drives first because attending is generally seen as more work. So if you're lower seniority, you are typically thought to attend first. So that's something you need to keep in mind as well. That's just, again, the culture. And again, vacation, if you need to do vacation posting or bidding, it's all seniority based. So the dispatcher or scheduler will call you based off seniority order to get the days that you want. It comes with pros and cons, but that's something to be aware of. Okay, so that's what it's like to be a paramedic. I hope this video was insightful. I hope you learned something from this. If you want more details about what it's like, just leave some comments down below and maybe I'll make another video on topics you want. But like I said, I just have experience in this field because I worked in it a few years and I thought it'd be interesting to share. Not a lot of people really dive into the 911 sphere or even think about it. That's what it's like to be a paramedic. All right, till next time. Bye.